Agenda this morning, we'll have first Mark Harrison share with us the outlook on China M&A. Mark is a deal advisor, partner of KPMG here in Shanghai. He began his career in London, where he spent 5 years working in audit and then specializing in cross-border financial due diligence, primarily for private equity clients. He then worked in Paris for over 5 years, focusing on cross-border engagements, including spending 6 months stationed in Chicago. Since 2008, Mark's been working with the Shanghai office, where he advises international clients on investments in China, including due diligence, vendor assistance, SPA drafting, and completion of accounts. Mark, if you would like to join me on stage, please, for your presentation. That will be put up now, I think. KPMG blue. Should you have more slides coming up? I'll give you the microphone. Maybe we just start as long as the IT is being put in place.
Do we have the clicker? Okay, good morning everybody. Just whilst we're getting the slides up, quick introduction on myself. I'm a deal advisory partner here in Shanghai. What that means is advising our clients through the whole M&A cycle. So we start off with market studies, target search, negotiation support, through to due diligence, valuation, and then post-deal integration. We have offices across China supporting our clients both on inbound investment and also outbound investment. So, could you have the slides? Great. Actually, I remember the first point on the slide, so we'll start with that. Great. So I just wanted to give you some comments on what we're expecting. Thanks, Frederick. Cheers. What we're expecting in terms of M&A this year and going forward. So the first thing to talk about is that whilst we have seen a slowdown in recent years in terms of inbound investment, my feeling from speaking to clients is that there remains a great deal of appetite to continue investing in China. Why is that? Well, quite simply, you speak to people at corporate level, they're still looking for very high growth globally, and the first place they look for is China. So whilst the other side of this is people talking about slowing GDP, need to reform in China, etc., when I speak to corporate level people, there's a lot of appetite and interest in China. And then when you speak to local executives of MNCs in China, they will also confirm that. In fact, most of them feel under a lot of pressure to grow their business, and they're struggling to find ways to do it because, for example, if they're being asked for double-digit growth, they look around and they think, okay, we're currently already doing $1 billion. That's quite common. Many multinationals doing that now. If you're being asked for 10% growth a year, that's a lot of growth to find. And you won't find it in tier 1 cities. So increasing interest in acquisitions, investments, joint ventures into tier 3, tier 4 cities. Having said that, the deals that we're working on are becoming more complicated. The easy deals are done. They were either done years ago, or the companies that are easy to acquire have listed themselves. They've grown. Those low-risk investments are done. What we're seeing today is I spend much longer time on deals than a typical Western investor would expect to see. We do a lot of work doing carve-outs, restructurings, asset transactions, whatever it takes to get the deal done. And the interesting thing in that context is that the clients are willing to do that. Before, they would just walk away as soon as there was a problem. The point to highlight, however, is that the valuation gap, which has always existed in China, I actually think is increasing. Because on the one hand, the multinationals have become very rational in their valuation. I sit in negotiation meetings and we'll have a multinational who is basically being asked how much they would consider paying for a company, and they say, well, in our sector we pay 7 times EBITDA, period, that's it. And of course, the seller is expecting a much higher number, 15, 20 times, based on multiples that they're seeing on the Shanghai A-share or in the Shinsanban, etc. All these different type of boards that are available. And we're waiting to see if the sellers, the Chinese sellers, will correct their expectations. We shall see. Secondly, obviously we've just come out of the 19th Chinese Communist Party Congress, and there was a number of interesting messages coming out of that in terms of inbound investment. First of all, there was a very clear message from Xi to say, we continue to encourage foreign direct investment in China. We want to make sure there's a level playing field. We want to make sure foreign companies' interests are protected. Now, that's been said before, but there are a number of positive, specific actions. The most obvious one is about IP protection. That's always been a great concern. If you ever speak to people at corporate level overseas, the number one thing on their agenda is, I would like to invest in China, but I'm very worried about my IP. And going forward, this is more of an issue, because we're moving from, obviously, from a basic manufacturing sort of investment from 5 to 10 years ago into a time now and going forward where it's about technology, it's about pharmaceutical, for example, pharmaceutical R&D investment. It's about consumer products and brands. So people are very concerned about that, but they made a very clear message that going forward that will be protected. And of course, that's also going to help some of the Chinese companies in their outbound investment and what they're doing in China. So hopefully it's going to help everybody. They also said there would be clearer rules. Currently, a lot of people complain there's a lot of vagueness in PRC rules about what you can and can't do. Again, let's wait and see, but there's some positive signs. Talk about quality growth, which is what people are concerned about. We want to make sure it continues going at a good level of GDP and it's profitable for everybody. One thing to be a little wary about is the whole China 2025. This made in China idea. We have to wait and see what does that mean for multinationals who are active in those high-tech and advanced technology areas, because there's going to be probably a lot of subsidies from the Chinese government going into the local competitors, and how are the MNCs going to deal with that? In terms of what are we seeing in hot sectors, I'm seeing a lot into healthcare. So that's different types of transactions. That's things like retirement homes, hospitals, nursing care, medical devices, many types of medical devices. I think that's quite obvious why people are interested in that. Aging population, relatively profitable business, growth area. Next is huge change to services. The vast majority of the deals I'm working on today are in the service sector, much less in industrial. So it covers things like distribution, maintenance, restaurants, all this type of thing. Communication centers, data centers, lots of transactions like that. E-commerce, obviously we all know e-commerce is a huge area in China, but many of our retail and consumer clients, they're looking to invest in small e-commerce startups as a starting point for their investments in China. Anything environmental related, we're seeing that's an obvious opportunity for foreign companies who have got market-leading technology. So around, for example, biomass energy, water filters, high-tech batteries, power sensors, products for self-driving cars, etc. And finally, revisiting joint ventures, which for many years were a bit no longer of interest because of the problems people have had with joint ventures in the past. But there's an interest in partnering with local companies because they propose that they offer something that the multinationals don't have. And typically that can include market access, understanding of markets, stronger sales team, better government connections. And even in some cases, we have clients interested in partnering with SOEs. Now, in that context, whilst there's continuing investment, we do see concerns around margins. Now, it's always been true that when you look at the profitability of a Chinese local company run by a Chinese entrepreneur, it's much more profitable than when you start modeling what it will look like if it's run by a multinational, because of what I would call full compliance costing. So taxes, paying VAT, paying CIT, paying IIT, paying social security. And then adding on to that, all the investments and upgrading that the multinationals want to do. So they want to make sure there's full compliance with health and safety. They want to make sure there's good internal controls. They want to make sure there's a robust ERP system. And all of these things cost money. In the past, because the local businesses were very profitable, even when you added in these costs, the net result showed a business that still made sense. But I've seen deals this year where the local companies are, I wouldn't say they're struggling, but they're under pressure. There's a lot of price pressure. The cost of materials are going up. They work in very competitive markets. Labor costs are increasing. And then when you work all of these out and add on all the M&C costs, we've actually seen some companies that are either break-even or loss-making. So there's a need to be considering that at an early stage. Think about what are the implications. It's particularly a problem in the service industry because they have a proportionately large amount of labor costs. And we're not talking about low-end workers, we're talking about semi-skilled workers with higher salaries. And I think there's a need to consider how an MNC wants to run those businesses post-deal. I'll come back to this later, but there's a point about how far do you need to integrate a business? There's plenty of examples in my experience of clients who have over-integrated acquisitions, such that they've effectively kind of killed the entrepreneurial spirit that they acquired and the reasons they acquired the business, and it's not as profitable as they expected. If we then look into the outbound investment, well, the first half of this year, there was a big decrease in outbound investment, driven by government policy, capital controls, which led to a kind of in our business, something like a 30 to 40% decrease in the first half of the year in work that we were doing. Now, some of that we benefited from work that was actually agreed at the end of last year. So I suspect in real terms, the decrease was more significant. And we can see that the government policy is that they want to make sure that the outbound investment is going to places that make sense and it's rational investments. It's clear that going forward, they're going to restrict investments into things like real estate, speculative investments, and then some things that you could call vanity projects, things like acquiring foreign football clubs, acquiring foreign film production companies. These kind of deals are being stopped because they're considered to not make sense. Now, the slowdown that we've seen has been particularly with the privately owned enterprises because I think they've become nervous. They know that there's some government policy concerns around outbound investment, and they want to make sure that they'll be able to do the deals. Because there's a number of things to consider. One is the size of the transaction. There was some policies announced at the start of the year that said any deal over $10 billion must be reviewed by Central SASAC. anything over 1 billion, which is non-core, things like football clubs, need to be reviewed. And then there was a second tranche of rules to do with foreign exchange, which basically said that anything over $50 million has to be reviewed by SAFE. And the interesting thing there is that whilst in the past, SAFE needed to review foreign currency exchange, they now have the power to actually stop transactions, or certainly slow them down. Going forward, we think there's going to be a shift, and we can already see it happening, away from POEs acquiring consumer product businesses in Europe and North America towards SOEs doing Belt and Road projects in countries targeted for the Belt and Road. So Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, etc. We've already seen it. We've just completed a deal for one of our clients who's invested $1 billion in a port in Sri Lanka. And the whole dynamics of those deals and the type of companies doing those deals is going to be very different from what we've seen for the last 3 to 4 years. I then just had a slide here I wanted to share with you about kind of top tips for investment in China. There's lots of examples of these sort of slides. This is some points very much from my own experience working in China about what I think is important. So I'll quickly run you through them, and then maybe we have some time for some Q&A. The first one is about minority shareholders. There are a large number of multinational companies who have a clear policy that they will insist to acquire 100% of a business, no matter what. I personally believe if you're buying a small POE in China, and the same applies to anywhere in the world actually, you need to keep the founder in the equity of the business for transition, because they're typically small companies, they don't have mid-management, the employees are all loyal to that person, and in China you have the additional risks around tax and social security exposure. And basically you can use the minority shareholding as a pledge and security against indemnification. Second thing is about over-committing on price on LOIs. I see this problem all the time. I get clients coming to see me, and it's the situation where we're just being asked to do due diligence and deal structuring. And they say, here is an LOI that I signed last week. Please can you help us with the due diligence? I read the LOI, and it says, we agree to pay 100 million renminbi for 100% of your business. Full stop. And I say, why did you agree to that? And they say, well, the seller insisted, and we've been told that's local market practice. And I say, that's nonsense. That's absolute nonsense. Because I would say, when we've been able to help clients from the beginning, or when the clients have had a very good financial advisor working with them, we see LOIs that have different structures. So it would say something like, either it could be a range, like we will pay between 80 million and 120 million subject to due diligence, or something like we will pay 8 times FY17 EBITDA subject to due diligence. Now, I heard some laughing in the audience, so I guess you know what I'm getting at here, but the point is that if you've locked in at 100 million, no matter what I find in due diligence, the price will never change. You have to have room for maneuver in the LOI. Number 3, benchmarking and context. It's what we try very hard to do. It would be very easy for me to provide a list of problems if you're investing in a Chinese local company. Every deal I've worked on, there are problems. but you have to consider it against what is a reasonable benchmark, okay? So for example, I've had, to give an example of the misunderstanding, I've had foreign clients come to me and they say, hey, we've got this great target. It all seems good. It even has an audit opinion. That's good news, right? And I'm like, well, no, not really, because pretty much every company in China is required to have an audit opinion, but the audit work is very, very limited. And by the way, how many audit adjustments are there? The answer is typically none, okay? On the other side, a client will get very worried when they hear that there's off-book revenue. Sometimes they want to kill the deal. And I say, well, hold on a minute. The majority of companies like this that I see have off-book revenue. This target company only has 5% of off-book revenue, whilst typically we can see 20-25%. Number two, they have full supporting records for the off-book. In fact, the off-book revenue is even included in their ERP system. And their main set of accounts are actually quite well prepared. They recognize revenue based on delivery date, they do proper cost accounting, accrual accounting, and overall, it looks quite good. And those off-book revenue, we can go and do a lot of testing on it to make sure it exists. So we think that deal's doable, whilst that business that may well be audited, there's a whole load of other problems with it. Number 4, margins under your ownership. I mentioned that before. On the other side, compliance issues. Compliance can cover many things. On one hand, it's tax and social security, legal risks, and on the other side, it's anti-bribery and corruption. Again, the conversation I have many times when I'm overseas is almost every small company you look at in China will have these problems. Okay, will have these challenges, it's a fact. You need to think how you're going to deal with it. So, what comfort do you need? How are you going to manage the risks? And what happens if you stop those activities post-deal? Number 6, SPA. I just simply give an example of what often comes up with my US clients who work in a different legal jurisdiction. There is an idea that you can do very lightweight due diligence and then sue the sellers post-deal. Works quite well in the US, it doesn't work in China. You have to do thorough, detailed due diligence, get to the bottom of the issues. Number 4, over on the far side, over-integration. Again, I see this regularly, and I think going forward it has to be avoided to make sure that the businesses you're acquiring are successful. In the past, people were typically buying companies either for export in the early days, maybe more recently as part of their global supply chain. But going forward, well, already and going forward, it's about the China for China idea. So if you're buying a company, you're buying it because it's successful in China, not because you want it to be a mirror image of your corporate overseas. So let it be good and continue being good for the reasons that you bought it. And finally, a quick comment on joint ventures. It's a very big topic, we can talk about that a lot, but my number one takeaway is remember that joint ventures are not forever. Plan for the exit. Assume it will end, and then everything can be managed well. Okay? So that's what I wanted to share with you for now. I'm not quite sure how the timing is, Frederick or Iona. Is there time for a few questions? Or any questions? Yes, sir. Sure. Actually, we've seen a trend in the last few years for foreign SMEs interested in investing in China. there are a number of challenges that they face. Number one is they're obviously new to China. So they're a long way behind many of the MNCs in terms of understanding the risks and the opportunities. And the second challenge I find is that they are typically family-owned companies, which makes them very well run, very solid, but very conservative. So when you're looking at China investments, they often see the risks as too high. So my experience from the last few years of working with a number of them is that 90% of those deals have been terminated very early on because they just walk away. They think it's too difficult, too risky. And the final problem sometimes is that, honestly speaking, they're not very keen to spend a lot of money on advisors and consultants. So they do something light, or they try to do it themselves, and it doesn't work. But having said that, there's many opportunities for them. You know, if you think about things like the German, Mittelstand, right, in Germany, there's many great businesses. They've got niche products, advanced technology, lots of opportunities for them in China, but they need to think how to position themselves. Okay, great. Thanks very much.